It was getting late. Diane didn't know how late, but it was too damn late for anyone to be calling. She hoped it was Marty's phone and not hers. Either way, she just covered her face with a pillow and gave thanks when the ringing stopped after the fifth. And she was just getting comfortable when the ringing sounded again. Damn it! She shouted, opening her eyes again. Martin, answer your damn! The words were suddenly cut short as she realized her husband wasn't beside her in bed. She glanced at the clock, 3:37, picked up her phone from the nightstand, and wondered why her husband wasn't in bed. After all, he had been there when they went to bed hours ago. Yes, hello, she muttered into the receiver. Is this Diana Miller? Yes, it's her. Who is this? Are you Martin Miller's wife? Yes, for God's sake, yes. Who is this? Mrs. Miller, this is the emergency room at North City Medical Center. Your husband was brought in about an hour ago, and we still have your contact information from an incident a year ago. He was in a car accident. Could you come over right away? Oh my God, is he okay? No. I'm not at liberty to discuss his condition over the phone, ma'am. Would you please come over? Yes, of course. I'll be there as soon as I can. She ran upstairs where her daughter slept. Dallas, named after the city in which she was conceived, attended the local university but lived at home to save money. During her freshman year, she liked living in the dorms, but during her sophomore year, she decided that living near campus would not be conducive to her studies. Dal, wake up! Nothing. Dally, wake up! This time, she was lightly nudged in the shoulder. Still nothing. Dallas, wake up! Dallas sat up straight in bed and tried to focus her blurred eyes. There was a light on in the room. It was a short night. Dallas, your father was in an accident. He's in the emergency room. You need to get dressed. We need to go. Once dressed, both women drove to the hospital as fast as they thought was safe. Dallas began inundating her mother with questions about what had happened, but Diane couldn't give any more information than she had already told her. It seemed like an eternity to them, but given the lack of traffic at this time of night and morning, the drive only took about 10 minutes. There was an empty space near the entrance, and Diana had parked the car at a slight angle, but it didn't bother her in the slightest as they jumped out of the car and headed inside. They were led to Martin's room in the emergency room, and they were shocked at his condition. He was well bandaged and clearly unconscious. They were given forms to fill out. Grief doesn't exempt you from paperwork. Dallas moved her chair to be closer to her father. They stayed there for about an hour before a man and woman in police uniforms entered the room. Good evening, ma'am. I'm Officer Gail Stanton, and this is my partner, Robert Hansen. We were first on the scene of your husband's accident. Any word on his well-being? No one has told us anything, officer, Diane replied. Oh, this is my daughter, Dallas. We need to ask you some questions. I realize the timing isn't right, but it's best to do it as soon as possible. Of course. Do you know what your husband was doing at this time of night? That's the thing. He was home, and we went to bed together around 10 p.m. I didn't even know he wasn't home until the hospital called. Ma'am, Officer Stanton turned to Dallas. Can you confirm that? Actually, I can. We were watching a movie on TV that ended at 10, and then we all went to bed. I saw Dad go into Mom's bedroom. What movie? The officer asked. Something with Keanu Reeves in it. Some kind of action movie. Dad picked it out. It was his turn. Did you have any particular problems? Financial problems, maybe? Or marital ones? Nothing that all married couples don't face. No special problems, no. I just don't understand why he went out without my knowledge. Were the people in the other car hurt? That's just the thing, Mrs. Miller. It was a one-car accident. According to both witnesses, your husband's car was driving normally and then accelerated rather suddenly and slammed right into the big oak tree that stands on the corner of Highway 121 and 288. There were no skid marks, and no one remembers seeing any brake lights. Diane and Dallas looked at the officers when it came to them what they were implying. Are you implying that my husband did this on purpose? That he tried to kill himself? We have yet to inspect the car for possible mechanical problems. And of course, we'll need to talk to your husband when he wakes up. But we are considering that possibility as well. Are you sure there were no problems that you can think of? Officers, I love my husband very much, and we have a wonderful marriage. No, I don't see any problems. I'm sure he just lost control of himself or dozed off. It was very late. I'm sure there are reasonable. Diana burst into tears and couldn't finish the sentence. Officer Stanton put one of her cards on the table, asking them to call if they remembered anything else, and walked out of the hospital. Dallas closed the door to Martin's room for privacy. You didn't tell them. No, Dallas, I didn't, Mom replied as her tears subsided. It's none of their business and has nothing to do with it. Your father was fine with it. If he was, he'll say something when they talk to him. Then we'll cross that bridge. The next few days passed slowly for everyone. Martin was still unconscious. He had been admitted to the hospital, and Diana and Dallas spent as much time there as they could. They were often there together, but made sure he was never alone. Fortunately, Diane knew Martin's boss and had called him to let him know what had happened and that he would be away from work. She carefully avoided saying anything that might lead anyone to think that it might have been an attempt on his own life. The accident had occurred on Saturday night, and on Wednesday morning Martin began to regain consciousness. By noon, his eyes were open, although because of all the medical equipment, he could not do much more than look around. Diane was nearby and noticed this, walking over to his bedside and reassuring him that everything was going to be okay. A few seconds later, a nurse entered the room hurriedly, something on the monitors alerting her that the patient was awake. Diana returned to her seat to give the nurse a chance to do her job. Soon another medical staff entered the room to check on Martin's condition. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Diane went outside and called Dallas to let him know that her father was awake. Dallas didn't answer, so she left a voicemail. Soon most of the medical paraphernalia was removed. Martin's left arm was broken, but he was right-handed and didn't expect it to hinder him much. His throat was sore from the tube, so he was given a whiteboard so he could communicate. The nurse read the message and asked if he was sure. Martin nodded his head. The nurse quickly went out into the hallway as the tests continued. Mrs. Miller, I need to inform you that your husband has asked that you not be allowed in his room, and your daughter as well. What? He's my husband. I have a right to be with him. I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller, but the patient's wishes come first. Let me just talk to him and we'll work it out. Diana tried to step around the nurse but was never able to get any closer, so she resorted to yelling. Martin, 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 please talk to me. What's going on? Martin, Martin! Mrs. Miller, please stop yelling. You're disturbing our other patients. You can wait outside the room if you want, but if we catch you trying to enter the room or making a ruckus, we will escort you out of the building. Do I understand? Yes, you're free to go, replied Diana, who had no choice but to do otherwise. 45 minutes later, Dallas finally made it to the hospital. She found her mother sitting in a chair at the entrance to the room. Mom, why are you here? Your father forbade us from being in the room. Both of us. I mean, I understand why he forbade you, but why me? What the hell does that mean? And why did it take you so long to get here? I had just woken up when Bradley came by to see how I was doing. We kind of... Geez. You were having fun with your boyfriend instead of coming to see your father? I'm sorry, Mom, but he was still unconscious when I left, Dallas replied, in a tone that indicated she wasn't sorry. It was really stressful, and I needed to relieve the stress. It worked out great for what it's worth. When you get a chance, give me a call. No, Dallas, I'm not going to do that. And let's not talk about it now. It's disrespectful. The irony made Dallas grin. Next chapter. There was a knock on the door, and a tall, very attractive brunette walked in. She was dressed professionally, but not like a doctor, although her badge gave her away as an employee. Good morning, Mr. Miller. I'm Dr. Lassiter, one of the hospital's mental health specialists. How are you feeling? As well as can be expected, I suppose. It's been 9 days since the accident. He has regained the ability to speak, The whiteboard is a thing of the past. He'd asked when he might be discharged, but never got a clear answer. Until now. The hospital has asked me to spend some time with you. Is that okay with you? Do I have a choice? Not if you want to go home soon. I have to give you permission to be discharged, the psychiatrist replied, a puzzled smile on her face. Then let's get started. Dr. Lassiter pulled one of the chairs over to the bed and sat down, crossing her long legs. She took a few moments to review the folder she carried in her hands. So, you were brought in a little over a week ago after an accident in which you collided with a large tree. I also see that you have forbidden your wife and daughter from visiting you, and I suspect that these things are somehow connected. Connected, Martin replied. She has been unfaithful to me. Unfortunately, that's not uncommon these days, though it rarely leads to such a reaction. Maybe there's something else? Martin was silent for several minutes. He didn't really feel like talking about it, especially not with a pretty female doctor. He wondered if they had some old man he could talk to. Dr. Lassiter waited patiently. It wasn't the first time she had had to wait for someone to gather their thoughts to start talking. Her patience was rewarded. I've been suffering from depression, I guess. Nothing that could be diagnosed. It's just, like I said, I was depressed. About anything in particular or just in general? I couldn't do this. For a little over a year. Since the previous accident, right? Of course she knew. She probably had his entire medical history in her hands. She just wanted to get him to say it. Right. It wasn't even a terrible accident. I was in the back seat, my boss was in the passenger seat, and his boss was driving. We got hit from behind. There were no airbags or even very severe damage, but I wasn't prepared for it. I got whiplash and hit my head on the seat in front of me. I guess that's what caused the accident. The report says you had a mild concussion and whiplash, the doctor interjected. My doctors couldn't explain that. None of the ED medication helped one bit. They ran a bunch of tests, some more than once, and the best explanation I got was that something happened, and part of my brain was damaged. So you couldn't do it, resulting in your wife becoming dissatisfied with your sex life, which in turn led to her getting a lover. This eventually wore you down and led to the events of that evening. Roughly? In a nutshell, yes. And how long was it before your wife decided to take that step? 7 or 8 months, I think. I'm just a little uneasy about it. Anyway, everything was fine at first, but we were still hoping that my ability would come back. We talked about staying in bed all weekend, having a really good time. That, of course, never happened. Eventually, it dragged on so long that she decided to fulfill her needs elsewhere. Did she discuss this with you beforehand? No. I found out about it when I got home from work early. A hackneyed cliché, I know. What did you do? What could I have done? She was right when she said I couldn't do things. It wasn't her fault that I couldn't handle things, so she did what she had to do. And if, hypothetically, she had asked you beforehand, would you have agreed? You know, I've thought about it a lot, and part of me wants to say that I would have said yes because I loved her and wanted her to be happy. But I don't think I would have accepted it. We made vows, we made promises, and one of them was in sickness and in health. I wouldn't do that to her, so I couldn't be okay with her doing that to me. Obviously, she continued to see him. Obviously. And now that I knew about it, she became less restrained. I don't know if she started doing it more often, since I don't know how often they used to do it, but whereas before it was limited to during the day while I was at work, now there were weekend trips to the store, and some of that time she was obviously spending with Bill. That must have been difficult. Difficult isn't even something that can be described. But then again, I didn't think there was anything I could do. She deserved a sex life and I couldn't provide it, but the whole thing was killing me. Tell me about the night of the accident. We were watching a movie on TV as a family. We still had those nights, those moments. I kept my pain, emotional pain, to myself. It was probably a mistake, but I didn't want to burden Diane or Dallas. They kissed and hugged goodnight, and I got a good night from Dallas as she walked off in the other direction. I think it was then that I realized that she had completely lost respect for me as a father and as a man. I could hardly blame her for that, for I had no respect for myself either. I got ready for bed as usual. Diana did the same. It was the same as always. Every night, the same thing. I waited until Diane was asleep. Then I got dressed, grabbed my wallet and keys. I went upstairs and peeked into Dallas's room. She was asleep too. I kissed her and said goodbye. I went and got in my car. I knew it had airbags, but I figured if I hit hard enough, it wouldn't matter. I didn't have a specific plan. I was just driving around. I knew of a large oak tree, but it wasn't my immediate target. After driving past it the first time, I realized there were no obstacles there and I could drive up pretty straight. I drove by it again and headed straight for it. For several minutes, they sat in silence, letting the story digest in their brains. Finally, the doctor spoke. Mr. Miller, I want to thank you for being so open and honest with me today. That's a great rarity. I'm going to let you get some rest and take some time to process what you've told me. Is it okay if I come back tomorrow? I'm not going anywhere, he replied. They shook hands and Dr. Lassiter left the room. Martin picked up his cell phone, which he had left at home that evening, and which Diane had brought him before he had forbidden her, and answered several messages and emails, including messages from his boss. Then he closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Back at home, Diane tried to keep her cool. She was under the impression that Marty was okay with her relationship with Bill, that he had given her a gift because he loved her very much. Even when she had first heard about the accident, she no longer believed it was an accident. She had been sure he had nothing to do with it, but now she wasn't so sure anymore. She suspected that the police had spoken to her husband, but she hoped he hadn't said anything about her relationship with Bill. The police never contacted her again, technically not considered a crime. Case closed. Still, he never really objected, did he? If he had, she didn't remember it. And besides, she wasn't going to live in celibacy just because some idiot decided to finish off her husband's boss. That wasn't what she'd signed up for, and she wasn't going to settle for that now. When Marty got home, she would try to be more considerate of his feelings, more reserved with Bill, but there was no way she was going to give it up. Next chapter. The next morning, Dr. Lassiter came in as promised. She walked the same way, took one of the inconspicuous sturdy chairs, of which there were two in each room, and sat down. Marty watched her with interest. How are you feeling this morning, Mr. Miller? Not much changed from yesterday, Doc. Ready to go home, but I guess that's up to you. Partially, yes, but by state law, you've been detained for 72 hours, and technically that didn't start until you and I started talking yesterday. So, 2 more days at least. That's fine, Doc. At least the food here isn't too bad. It's always bad, they picked up together, sharing a hearty laugh. Old but kind, Dr. Lassiter remarked. But I'm glad you're joking. So am I. It's been a while, and by a while I mean months. I haven't felt like, well, myself. I used to be a pretty good joker to the point where I sometimes got on Dallas's nerves. We didn't have bad thoughts anymore? We didn't go down dark alleys in our minds anymore? You know, Doc, no. I spent a year pretty depressed, and the last few months I've been really depressed. I don't feel that way anymore. It's been replaced by anger, frustration, annoyance, by Diane and Dallas, more Diane, of course, but mostly by myself, for failing to stand up for myself, to let my wife know that what she was doing was unacceptable. And now you intend to stand up for yourself? Absolutely. While I admit I'm tempted to just file for divorce, I have to take some of the blame for letting her overstep her bounds. But if she's willing to stop seeing Bill, then I'm willing to go to a counselor and try to repair our marriage. I can appreciate your determination, Mr. Miller. I rarely see such a quick turnaround. I had plenty of time to think as I lay here before you came in. I am grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to voice them, to tell someone. It allowed me to focus my thoughts. Excellent, Mr. Miller. Just excellent. In that case, I won't be late today. I have a few more patients than yesterday, so I can use that time. I'll stop by tomorrow for one last chat with you. but I don't see any reason why you won't be able to leave on schedule. Looking forward to it, Doc. Diana and Dallas were there to pick him up when he was free. If he was going to try to get things back on track, he had to start by acting like things were going to be restored. There was still healing to be done. The airbags had been surprisingly effective, far more effective than Marty had anticipated. Worst of all was the concussion he had received, which had caused him to spend a lot of time resting and relaxing in the dark. The TV was off, and gentle music was playing in the background. His wife and daughter were caressing him. All was well for a little over a week until Diane announced that she needed to go shopping. No, Marty said calmly. What? Replied Diane, perplexed. Marty, there are things we need, including some of your healing creams. Make a list for Dallas. She can go. Why are you dragging me into this, Dad? Besides, I have plans to meet Bradley. Then you'll have an incentive to finish shopping sooner, won't you? Diane, the list. This is ridiculous, Martin. You can't just come home and turn our routine upside down. Dallas has his own plans, and I'm going to the store, and that's final. Do you think I'm stupid, Diane? Stupid? No, Marty, of course not. Why would you ask such a thing? You think I don't realize that these shopping trips are an excuse to visit Bill? I've never come home with groceries, Martin. Not once. Yes, and it's a great cover. But you've been away too long, and not only that, but I can see it in you. By your eyes when you won't look at me. By your clothes when they don't look quite right. By your makeup, which is always a little messed up. At least some of the time you spend with Bill, and that's gone. The shock in Diane's eyes was obvious, and Dallas suddenly felt a little more respect for her father. Marty, please, we've been over this before. I'll do my best to be more careful now. Obviously, I've gotten too relaxed with my meetings, but I'm definitely not giving up on him. So our vows mean nothing? Renounce all others? In sickness and in health? Well, that's about sickness, and you don't give up the others, but you will do so, starting today. You're going to stop seeing Bill, and we're going to see a therapist to repair our marriage. Or you won't do it, and we won't do it, and I'll call a divorce lawyer on Monday. You're not going to do any of that, Martin Miller. Don't you dare threaten me. If I could do this with you and only you, I would, but I can't. And it's not my fault. I didn't cause the accident. I wasn't even there. Suddenly, because I had nothing to do with it, my sex life is gone, and I'm supposed to just accept it? It's not going to work. So I'm going shopping, I'm going to Bill's, and I'm going to get my needs met. If you want to talk more about this tonight, we can do that. But don't you dare think you can dictate to me what I can and can't do. Without waiting for another word from her husband, Diana walked out the door, closing it with a clatter. The silence was deafening. Father and daughter looked at each other, and then Marty retired to his bedroom. For the first time in her life, Dallas Miller worried about the future of her family, her parents' marriage. Her father had never stood up to her mother, but nothing so serious had ever come between them. But deciding that it was between them and there was nothing she could do about it, she cleaned herself up and went to meet Bradley. Next chapter. Damn it, Dal, what's the matter? Asked Bradley disappointedly. I'm sorry, Bradley. I'm just worried about my folks and I can't stay in this mood. Come on, baby, let's have some fun. It'll take your mind off them. Jesus, Bradley, haven't you ever thought about anything else? Hell, we don't do anything else but have fun. How about taking me out on a date to distract yourself? How about bowling or dinner or miniature golf or anything else besides what we're doing? That's fun and enjoyable, and I don't like bowling or miniature golf, so why the hell should I take you there? Replied Bradley. A light finally went on in Dallas's head. You're right, you wouldn't, and you don't have to worry about that anymore. I'm going home, and it's over between us. Find someone else to do nothing with. Dallas walked out of Bradley's bedroom one last time, ignoring his pleading, Dal, let's go. Bradley was a good-looking guy, but she suddenly realized he was too young. He had no ambition or desire to develop their relationship. He was just trying to finish college so he could get a job at his father's company, and she doubted he could do anything more there than get a paycheck and a position. Suddenly, the front door slammed. Damn that boy. How many times did I have to tell him not to slam the damn door? Bill said irritably. Relieved, Diane realized that she didn't like Bill, and she didn't really like him at all. And Bradley was a lazy slob. Next chapter. When Dallas returned to the family home, it was getting dark outside. She found her father resting in his bedroom. A faint light was coming from the bathroom, where the light was on and the door was ajar. She realized her father wanted some light, but none of the lights in the room burned that low. Dad. He stood with his back to her and didn't turn around, but he answered nonetheless. Dallas. I'm sorry. That got his attention, so he carefully sat up in bed and turned to see his daughter crying in the doorway. For what? He'd stopped calling her affectionate words when he'd found out she'd helped her mother find a lover, and he hesitated to do so now, even though she was crying. He couldn't help but think it was just as much of a setup. Dallas stepped closer until she was at the foot of the bed. I'm sorry for what I did. I was just trying to help my mom, you know. She was so upset about what you were going through, and the fact that you couldn't. Their eyes met for a moment. Well, you know you couldn't. And Bradley's father went through the same thing after Mrs. Coyle died. Bradley says his father talks all the time about how much he misses her, especially the closeness. I thought they could take care of each other. I'm sorry, but I never thought about how it would affect you. So, is that why you, did what you did that night? Marty was surprised at such an unexpected revelation from his daughter. It might still be a hoax, but he had to take her confession at face value. If he'd been fooled, hurt, deceived again, then so be it. Mostly, I guess. I was still pretty depressed anyway, just because I couldn't, what I couldn't. Father and daughter met gazes again, this time exchanging a brief smile. But it's over now, Dally. I won't do it again. I hope you won't. I still need you. Are you going to divorce your mom? I haven't made a final decision yet, honey, but I don't see any other way out unless she stops seeing Bill. But keep it to yourself. She has to change because she wants to, not because she's forced to. Okay, Dad. I'll go upstairs. Oh, did I break up with Bradley today? Marty tried to hold back a smile. He'd never particularly liked the guy, but it surprised him because she seemed to be in love with him, or had been once upon a time. Why? Marty asked, surprised at this turn of events. Because, Dallas began, and then paused to think. Because my dad once told me he wasn't good enough for me. And I finally realized he was right. I finally realized that my dad was right about a lot of things. A smile appeared on Marty's lips as he realized that his girl had grown up a lot today. Dallas walked over to her father and hugged him, realizing that it was the first hug they'd had in a long time. Finally, they pulled away, smiled at each other, and Marty watched Dallas silently leave the room and go upstairs. No sooner had his daughter's bedroom door closed than Marty heard the chirp of Diane remotely locking her car. The good feelings that had just filled him with joy vanished in an instant. He lay down again and closed his eyes. A moment later, Diane walked into the bedroom. She was taking a shower at Bill's, and Marty decided it was best if she came back fresh, although they could both telegraph exactly what Diane had been up to. Could you help with the groceries? Is there really groceries here? Asked Marty, pulling herself up. Yes, Marty. I told you I'd get groceries, and I did. Marty dragged the bags from the car and unloaded them on the counter. He noticed that they contained no refrigerated or frozen food, all to restock the pantry. He also found the receipt, and judging by the time, she had left the grocery store almost 2 hours ago. From the looks of it, she had gone shopping first before heading out to meet Bill. Even though Marty knew she would, the evidence lying in front of him still hurt. After putting his things away, Marty wordlessly made his way to the bedroom to lie down. He wondered if it was even worth bringing it up again. There was really no point. Diane had made it clear what she intended to do, so the next question was his reaction. Something had to change. Did you want to talk some more? his wife asked in a tone that said it wouldn't do any good. No, Diana, you've made your position clear. Diana's face and tone softened. She loved her husband and didn't want to lose him. He was still her best friend and the person she most enjoyed spending time with. She didn't think her own satisfaction should be an issue under the circumstances, and she hoped Marty would eventually feel the same way. Are you hungry? She asked, distracting him from his musings. No, I made fettuccine while you were gone. I hope you had a salad? You haven't been very good with vegetables lately. No, there was no salad, but I made spinach. Diana nodded approvingly and headed to the closet to get dressed. She had thought about getting back to intimacy with her husband, something she missed so much, but today was not the occasion. By the time she'd changed clothes, Marty was already asleep, or at least pretending to be very well. Next chapter. The divorce didn't go smoothly. Diane was furious when she was handed the papers. Marty had been kind enough to send them to the house and didn't fail to point out that he was out with Dallas at the time, having moved into the guest room, which was upstairs next to Dallas's room. Diane fought hard against the divorce. She hired a very aggressive attorney, and he made every effort. They even tried to have him declared mentally incompetent, citing a suicide attempt. Marty, anticipating that she would try something like that, and because he thought it was a good idea, went to a psychologist the same week he was served with the papers. The psychologist he went to was highly respected and certainly not cheap. And when he testified that Marty was definitely no longer a suicide risk, the judge agreed and the matter dropped. The argument could have gone on for a long time, but just when it looked like Diane was ready to put her feet up, Dallas intervened. She let her mother know that they were wrong, that Diana's needs did not outweigh the vows and promises she had made. Life wasn't always fair, and she had to support her husband and suffer by his side. Dallas also made it clear that any further resistance would damage their future mother-daughter relationship, possibly forever. Faced with the loss of her husband and daughter, Diane decided she had no choice and dropped her objections to the divorce. The house was sold. Marty agreed to alimony for several years, knowing that a judge would award it anyway. Diane got herself a 2-bedroom apartment near work and was able to go full-time 8 months after the divorce, but the divorce left her bitter and angry, especially when Bill let her know it was over between them. He seemed to have several other women he was having fun with, and Diane lost her attraction once she was no longer married. Dallas continued to attend school, alternating between being with both parents, though as time went on, Diane stopped playing the victim role and continued to blame Marty for the divorce. If she heard her mother say one more time, "If only he had been more understanding," she would have screamed. And Marty? Well, next chapter. Marty entered the dimly lit club around 10 p.m. It was Friday night, and he just wanted to get out of the house. He just wanted to spend some quality time. He wanted to drink and maybe dance. He had been so unlike himself lately, and he wanted to change that. He took a seat at the bar and ordered a rum and coke. As he sipped his drink, he glanced around at the customers who were with him that evening and noticed a face at the far end of the bar that seemed familiar, but he couldn't locate it. A nearly empty wine glass stood in front of her. Marty shifted his gaze to her and thought for a moment, and then he turned back. He sat on the edge of consciousness for a couple minutes, and then it hit him. A small smile appeared on his lips, and he picked up his drink, carrying it carefully as he approached the woman. She looked up at him as he approached her. "Dr. Lassiter?" She looked him in the eye and studied his face for a while, but she didn't immediately recognize him, and Marty thought he might have the wrong person. "I'm leaving Dr. Lassiter at the hospital. Here in the real world, it's Vicky. But I'm afraid you've put me at a disadvantage. It's been quite some time, and I'm sure you've interacted with far more patients than I have with excellent psychologists. I'm much better with names than faces. Try me. Martin Miller." Vicky thought about the name for a moment, and Marty waited patiently for her to admit defeat. He watched her carefully, and if you asked him later, he'd swear he saw a light bulb go on in her brain. "Ah, Mr. Miller. An unfaithful wife and a rather unexpected collision with a tree, if I'm not mistaken. You're not mistaken, and I'm amazed. We've only spoken twice in a year, heck, almost 2 years ago. It's a gift. Care to join me? Marty took a seat, signaling the bartender to fill their drinks. Thank you. My pleasure. So, what brings you here tonight? Meeting someone? Asked Marty. Trying to, Vicky replied, and the gleam in her eyes made her meaning clear. Really? I thought I remembered a rather impressive stone on your finger. Perhaps you did. It was a little before my divorce became final. I wore rings in an attempt to convince my husband, ex-husband, that he really had nothing in common with a 20-year-old cashier other than a desire to invite one of her friends into his bed. I'm afraid I didn't succeed. Oh my God. Are they still together? This may surprise you, Mr. Miller, but since the divorce, I've completely lost interest in Wayne's relationship. I don't have the slightest clue. Of course you do. That was a stupid question. And please call me Marty, Martin, or even Jerk. Anything but Mr. Miller. What did your wife call you? Marty. All right, Martin. Would you like to take me to the dance floor? I'd love to. Martin asked the bartender to leave their drinks behind the bar, then took Vicky's hand and led her to the dance floor. It was a rousing number, and they quickly got into the rhythm. This song was followed by another fast song, and then a slower song began. All the while they stayed on the floor, and on the slow song they pulled themselves to each other. Vicky wrapped her arms around Martin's neck, and his hands pressed firmly against her back. Being a guy, Martin immediately noticed the lack of a bra. They stared into each other's eyes for a while before Vicky rested her head on his shoulder. 2 slow songs followed, and they didn't break their embrace when the second song began. Martin was immersed in the sensations of this beautiful, soft woman who smelled simply amazing. As the song faded out, Vicky took advantage of the slight lowering of the music volume to say a few words. How about you take me back to your place and do something about it? Martin took her hand and walked back to the bar, paying the bill and informing the bartender that they didn't need any more drinks. He didn't look surprised. She took an Uber to the club, they got into his car, and Martin started the drive back to the apartment he'd bought. It was small, but he appreciated that he no longer had to tend to the lawn. Vicky, maybe I'm asking a little late, but how much have you had to drink? It was my first glass of wine on the bar when you came over. Why? Because I don't take advantage of drunk women. Don't worry, Martin. And they pulled into the underground parking garage and took the elevator to his floor. As soon as the door closed, Vicky immediately said, "Then show me to your bedroom." An hour later, they were about to fall asleep, but Martin had one more question. Vicky? Do you think you're ready for another serious relationship? There was a long pause, and Martin was afraid he had made a mistake and scared her. He half expected her to get out of bed and ask for a ride home. There was no doubt in her attractiveness to him, and not just in her physical beauty. She was intelligent, and he enjoyed her company. Of course, it wasn't love yet, but she was the first woman he'd met since his divorce that he'd even considered. Why don't we talk about it in the morning? Sure. Good night, Vicky. Good night, Martin. Next chapter. Vicky woke up before Martin did. He seemed calm, so she just let him sleep. She showered and then went to the kitchen to see what she could make for breakfast. Martin's question before bed caught her off guard. Not that she wasn't attracted to him, but she was really focused on having a good time. She had been telling herself for months that she didn't need a man in her life, and to some extent that was true. She had a good job and wonderful friends, so she didn't need a man. But to be completely honest with herself, she did want one. But would a decent guy even want her after she told him the truth? Martin was awakened by the smell of something cooking. He rushed into the kitchen and found her. I was going to take you out for breakfast. It's too late. You can take me out to lunch. Go take a shower and breakfast will be ready. 10 minutes later, Martin returned to Vicky in the kitchen just as she was arranging the plates on the table. There was an omelet, a few slices of sausage, and a piece of buttered toast. I didn't realize I had sausage in there, she said. It was stashed in the freezer. I hope it's still good. Martin took a bite from one of the slices and said it tasted quite all right. Breakfast itself went relatively smoothly, and Martin took on the task of cleaning up the kitchen as Vicky had done him the courtesy of preparing the food. They chatted about nothing while everything was being prepared, and as the last plate was put away in the dishwasher, he turned to Vicky. Are you ready to talk? Ready as I've ever been. All right. Look, Vicky, I don't want to put you on the spot or pry into your business. If you're not interested in anything but fun, then so be it. You don't owe me anything. I know that. It's just that I need to tell you something, and why don't we do it in the bedroom? I'll be more comfortable there. They held hands and went into the bedroom. They sat on the bed facing each other. Martin, I know we only met last night, at least as people in the real world. I think you're a great guy and I'm definitely attracted to you, but there's something I need to tell you. I told you that my husband left me for a 20-year-old, and it's true. But that wasn't the whole story. The main reason he left me was because I couldn't have children. He wanted a family and was looking for someone to give him one. He didn't want to adopt. The fact that he didn't have children of his own, he saw as some sort of failure, and I was the reason. And no, I have no idea how he behaved after the divorce. I'm a guy in his 40s with a grown daughter. I wouldn't mind kids, but that's no reason to divorce. I'm glad to hear that. Another thing I want you to know, well, at least I want to be honest, is that I'm not too proud. After my divorce was finalized, I wasn't feeling my best. I was getting old and had just lost my husband to a woman almost half my age. I'm 37 in case you were wondering. I was wondering, but there was no way I would have asked. They both chuckled slightly. I also felt, well, inferior is probably the most appropriate word. Truth be told, I didn't feel like a woman at all. How can you be a woman and not have children? I know what you're thinking, but that's how I felt at the time. So I decided to prove that I was a woman, and if I couldn't be a woman by having children, then I was going to be a woman by satisfying men. Many of them, and mostly anonymously. I called myself Angela and wouldn't stop going home with someone when I wanted to. This went on for a few months until I realized it was self-destructive behavior and started seeing a therapist. But even then I continued to do it, though less frequently, until I finally reached a point in my life where I could stop. Isn't that what you were doing last night? Asked Martin cautiously. He wasn't judging her or wanting her to think that, but there was no doubting that she had been a cougar on the hunt last night. Yes, it was. I still have feminine needs, and I still go out occasionally to fulfill them. But whereas before I usually went out with whoever asked me out first, now I'm selective. There have been many nights when I've gone home alone and, taken care of myself. I suppose I should be glad I passed the test. You passed, Martin. You passed. I've really enjoyed spending time with you, and in answer to your question, I'd love to get to know you some more, but I'd like to be honest about what I've been through. I got tested and didn't get infected with anything, which was incredible luck. I don't need birth control, but I can provide a note from my doctor if you need proof. If you'd like to try it, I'd like us both to be tested and agree to an exclusive relationship. For several minutes, Martin sat in silence. Vicky waited patiently, but worried whether she had given him cause for concern about a possible relationship. Finally, he seemed ready to respond. Vicky, thank you for your honesty. I know it must have been very difficult. I think I owe you the same. Our experiences are not entirely different. After my divorce, I was glad I got through it, but I still felt depressed about my inability to perform. I had no idea how I was going to find a woman, and I was facing the prospect of living all alone. I had my own therapist, and he pointed out that as women age, many women lose interest in having fun. But I still felt like I would have to find a much older woman or wait a few years. When things seemed to be back to normal, I still wasn't at my best. And just like you felt like you needed to prove you were a woman, I felt like I needed to prove I was a man. I myself did a lot of walking the streets looking for women to bed, proving, at least in my mind, what a stud I was. I wasn't any more selective than you are. Some women were, Well, let's just say I rode a few city bikes and slept with a lot of them. It went on for a while, and I wasn't as lucky as you. I was woken up by gonorrhea. I also had to confess to my doctor that I had no idea what my partner's names were. We cleared the air, and I began to focus on my behavior during therapy. Next chapter. The almost inevitable confrontation with Diane occurred after Martin and Vicky had been dating for about 3 months. Their relationship was very strong, and Vicky and Dallas were getting along just fine. They still had their own place, but they spent every night together, and it looked like they were going to get married. They went to a club geared towards a more mature crowd. Music was played by a DJ, and interior walls separated the dance floor from the tables, allowing for conversation. Martin and Vicky enjoyed their drinks and chatted about this and that. The evening was going well, so Vicky was puzzled when Martin's smile suddenly disappeared and his eyes looked somewhere past her. She followed his gaze. Martin and Diana saw each other at almost the same time. While Martin's face remained neutral, a grin appeared on Diana's face as she made her way to the table. Even so long after the divorce, Diana had not stopped feeling bitter. She still believed she had done nothing wrong, except that she hadn't been discreet enough. But having her needs met by another man when her husband wasn't up to the task was definitely not on the list of wrong things to do. So when she approached the table, it wasn't her intention to be polite. "Marty, it's so good to see you," Diana said in a voice in which sarcasm was clearly audible. "Diane, Vicky, this is my ex-wife, Diane." "Diane, this is Vicky," Martin said, though he would have preferred not to. "It's nice to meet you, Diana. I've heard a lot about you." "Really?" "And I've heard absolutely nothing about you," Diana replied bitterly. "We're divorced, Diana. Have been for over a year now. My life is no longer your concern. Now, if you don't mind—" Martin left the phrase unanswered, but there was clearly a hint in it that he was suggesting that her ex-wife leave them alone. "Oh, of course, Martin. I hate to intrude on your date. But Vicky, there's something I have to tell you." "And what is that?" Vicky asked, glancing at Martin and then returning her gaze to Diana. "You probably don't need to worry about it. We're divorced because he can't do it anymore." Martin watched Vicky's reaction carefully, and Vicky did her best to suppress a slight giggle. She addressed her next statement to Martin, raising her eyebrows. "Is that true? I don't think you mentioned it." Martin merely shrugged. This was Vicky's game. Diane thought she had them in the palm of her hand, that she had brought discord into Marty's relationship, just as he had done with her and Bill. She was going to enjoy it. However, her happiness was short-lived. "That's good, it's working." "But how is that possible? Did they find the problem? Have they found a cure?" Martin and Vicky were silent, allowing Diana to only get more worried. "Come on, Marty. This problem ruined my marriage. I think I deserve to at least know what was wrong." The smile disappeared from Martin's face. "First of all, Diane, it was your antics that ended our marriage, not my condition. I admit it made things difficult, but you made the choice, not me. Second, you don't deserve a damn thing. We're divorced, and my business is my business alone. Come on, Marty. You can blame my choices all you want, and I can't say you're wrong, but I wouldn't have made those choices if everything was okay." "Okay, Diane. The doctors kept running tests, but they have no idea why he started working again. It just started working. They think the problem from the first accident just takes time to fix. If you had stayed sick with me, as our vows stated, and been patient, we'd still be married." Diana opened her mouth, trying to find something to say. This information shocked her. Martin had already considered pleading guilty to the tree incident, but thought that Diana would claim some sort of credit. She could claim that she was the one who made him regain his ability to function by encouraging him to hit the tree with his cheating, and that he somehow owed her. Best not to go down that path. I can't believe it. God must really hate me." "He just wants to be like everyone else," Martin muttered. "What was that?" asked Diana, flashing her eyes. "Nothing. Nothing at all. Now you know." Would you mind leaving us for the rest of our evening? Diana stood pensive for about 30 seconds, then looked Martin in the eye. You're right, Marty. I'm really sorry. I was wrong to do what I did. I was short-sighted and selfish. I should have been stronger. I ruined a good marriage. I'm sorry. Diana turned and left not only their table, but the club itself. Martin and Vicky watched her until she was out of sight, and they actually felt sorry for her. Martin then turned to Vicky again. Let's dance, my love. Epilogue. Martin and Vicky were married 6 months after the altercation with Diana at the club, and little Ella was born about 9 months later. Wait a minute, you thought. Vicky can't have kids. Well, she can't. Let me explain. Martin and Vicky had only been married for a few months when Martin heard the words every man dreads. We need to talk. Babe. One Sunday morning, they were sitting around the table at breakfast. Vicky's schedule was to make breakfast every Saturday, and Martin did the same on Sundays. Martin had noticed that Vicky had seemed preoccupied and distracted the last couple days, so when she placed a newspaper article in front of him in the middle of breakfast, he wasn't too surprised. What's this, sweetheart? Read it, please. Martin flipped through the article. It said that a guy named Wayne Jessup had been killed by police officers when they responded to a domestic disturbance call. The article was dated about a month earlier and gave some details about the scandalous relationship between the deceased and his much younger girlfriend, who had a 3-month-old baby. It was a tragic story, but it meant nothing to Martin. Okay, I've read it. So? Honey, Wayne Jessup is my ex-husband. Martin realized they'd never really talked about him, except for that short story about why he'd left Vicky for a cashier or something. Wow. Are you okay? How are you feeling? I was in shock, of course. He was never violent when we were together, so it didn't make any sense. And I felt really bad that this young girl had to go through something like that. I agree. But what does it have to do with us? I didn't feel responsible, but I felt, I don't know, involved, I guess. Like I should do something to help. Okay, Martin replied, wondering where this was going. You know the paper sometimes calls on me for research or statistics or whatever, for articles they're working on. So I did a small favor and asked them to contact her on my behalf. As a person and ex-wife, not as a mental health professional. I asked them to tell her that I was Wayne's ex-wife and that I'd be happy to help her, and they gave her my contact information. I assume she called, got in touch with him somehow. Yes, she called. I've talked to her on the phone and even in person a couple times over the last few weeks. And you're only telling me this now? I'm sorry, babe. The first time I met with her in secret because it seemed like the best choice at the time. After that, I felt like I was betraying her trust. So I treated it as a professional matter. I knew I would eventually tell you, and here we are. Okay, what do you need to tell me? I assume this is the girl he left you for. Actually, no. That girl's name was Amy, and she dumped Wayne because he was pressuring her to have a baby, and apparently she didn't want one for a few more years, if at all. The Carly I've been in contact with is the other girl. Okay, so you've been talking to her. Wayne started pushing her too. She wasn't sure she wanted kids either, but she liked the idea of starting a family and thought he really loved her, so she agreed. But as soon as the baby was born, he started being rude and abusive to her. First verbally and then physically. A few times she let it pass, thinking it was just the stress of having a baby, but the last time it got really bad, and she called the police. She figured they'd take him to jail to calm him down and they'd talk the next day. Obviously, that's not what happened. When he found out she had called the police, he started screaming and swearing and pulled a gun out of the dresser. She says she didn't even know he had a gun and hid in the baby's room thinking he was going to use it against her. The cops showed up a couple minutes later, and he went outside to confront them. Carly was still hidden, but could hear everything perfectly. Wayne started telling them to get off his property, that everything was fine, and they had no right to be there. They were trying to talk him out of it when he apparently pulled out a gun because Carly suddenly heard them yelling at him to drop it. Soon she heard gunshots. Carly lay low, not realizing what was going on. She came out when police officers started searching the house and calling for her. No one said anything to her, but she saw a body covered with a sheet outside the door and realized it must be Wayne. How traumatizing that must have been for her. I'm sure she still had feelings for him, and it was very scary to relive that. That's what she said. According to the report, Wayne shot at something and even hit one of the police cars. They returned fire, and that was the end of it. A tragedy. Just tragic, Martin said, not knowing what else to say. How's Carly now? She's fine. She's going to counseling. Not to me since I'm too close, but I referred her to someone. I think she'll be fine. They sat in silence for a couple minutes, mostly just silently contemplating the tragedy that had played out. Martin, there's something else. Somehow I'm not surprised. The thing is, Carly doesn't really want to be a mother. At least not yet. But she's afraid to just hand the baby over to the system. Babies get adopted very quickly, Vicky. She won't be there for long. We both know that, but... Okay, I'm just going to say it. Carly wants me, I mean us, to adopt a baby. Of course I told her I'd have to talk to you about it. But Martin, God, I want this baby so badly. Martin was shocked. He had never expected to be a father again, both because of his age and Vicky's inability to have children. And here was another child, and an infant, possibly ending up on his lap. Vicky filled the silence. I spoke to one of the social workers and a lawyer at the hospital. They said that this kind of planned adoption isn't very common, but it's not uncommon, and it's perfectly legal. Did you talk to other people about it before you talked to me? Martin, I didn't want to talk to you about it if it didn't work out. I wanted to get all the information before I talked to you. And what does Carly want out of this? No money, if that's what you're thinking, although I'd like to help her get back on her feet. After all, she just lost her only source of support. All she wants is to stay in business. If not exactly in Ella's life as Aunt Carly, then at least pictures and news as she grows up. Martin was silent for a long time, going over all of this in his head. He understood every step Vicky had taken along the way, who she'd socialized with, and how she'd worked things out. He just wished he could go through it all with her, support her along the way. How about committing to another 18 years? By the time Ella graduated high school, he'd be in his 60s. Would he have the strength for that? The patience? Even as he asked himself these questions, he knew he would never deny Vicky what she wanted so badly. Martin, talk to me, please. Martin looked into his wife's big, beautiful, deep brown eyes. So, what is the next step in her adoption? That's how Ella became a member of our family. Of course, it wasn't instantaneous. There was a lot of bureaucracy to go through, but eventually the adoption was finalized, and they became a family of 3. 4, if you counted Dallas, who adored her new baby sister. Martin and Vicky helped Carly get a certificate at the local technical college, and she got a job at a dental office. She has started dating a young man who was a patient of hers, and it looks like it may be serious. They see each other a few times a year, and Vicky sends pictures in the meantime. Martin and Vicky are still happy and have no plans to have other children. Vicky is able to take Ella to the hospital daycare when she works and checks in on her several times a day. And Martin somehow finds a way to visit his wife and daughter several times a week. Have you heard from your ex since the divorce? One of the women seated at the table asked Brooke, sipping wine from a beaded glass. The ladies were seated comfortably on the terrace of the Travelers' Inn. Brooke Puckett thought for a moment before replying. No, since I kicked him out and handed him the divorce papers and restraining order, I haven't seen or heard from him. He tried to talk to the kids, but they ignored him after I explained what he had done to us. Ellie, new to the group, wondered, was it a bad break? I feel like there's still a lot of pain in it. When did the divorce take place? A year ago. That asshole fought him for a year. When he noticed the kids didn't want anything to do with him anymore, he just gave up, signed the papers, and left. But all in all, he's been gone for 2 years. Good riddance. Brooke said this with venom in her voice. Ellie's next question was obvious. Why did you do it? Divorced him, you mean? Because he cheated on me with his first love, Gemma Evans. A voice came from behind. Jake Van Dam cheated? No, he didn't. He's not that complicated. As for cheating with me, I'd remember that. Don't you find it? Impossible, absolutely impossible. I just think you're up to one of your dirty little games again, Mrs. Brooke Puckett. Brooke turned her head so quickly that the others thought her eyes popped out. She said, Well, look what the cat brought. You've got nerves. Look who's talking. You started manipulating Jake when we were still together. Your lies caused us to break up, and you have the nerve to claim Jake cheated on you with me? When the hell? Gemma replied. 2 years ago, as you well know. If Brooke's voice had claws, blood would have dripped from Gemma. Oh, no. If I'd had sex with Jake, I'd remember, wouldn't I? 2 years ago, I was 5,000 miles away, in Edinburgh, Scotland, studying general linguistics and tutoring non-English students. And I can attest to that with more justification than you can attest to being here at the moment. I'm back for a week after a 3-year move across the pond, and before that I taught high school on the other side of the country. Brooke turned white. This scenario was not what she had envisioned, and it was very bad news for her. If it wasn't Miss Evans, then who was your ex cheating on you with? Brooke cornered, bit her. He cheated on me and I kicked him out. Gemma wasn't finished and replied, And I think in the process of tarring and feathering you made it so he couldn't live here anymore. I think even his parents were fooled by your antics. I, for one, don't believe for a second that he was fooled at all, but was only following you. Are these children his? I could ask. But I have to go. I have things to do, people to talk to. Jake's parents, for instance. Brooke went white again. Don't you dare! I'll make your life hell. Gemma looked coldly at the once gorgeous woman, smirked, and said, Life hasn't been kind to you, has it? You need too much makeup to make yourself look presentable. Anyway, you shouldn't spread your feathers. You might get tar all over them. But I am obliged to pay a visit to your former in-laws and let them know that I have an alibi for the whole dastardly cheating incident. I bid you farewell. Gemma walked towards the exit and turned around one last time. Brooke, Jake didn't cheat, and I'm going to clear something up. Thank you for throwing him out. He'll be mine as soon as I find out where he is. About your threat? Don't be ridiculous. I'm leaving tomorrow for a new job, never to return to this nest of vipers. Now go suck lemons. With those words, Gemma walked to her car and headed straight for the Van Dam residence. The stately home was exactly as she remembered. 3 parking spaces by the gate. Just outside the gate were 2 giant ginkgo biloba trees planted by Jake's great-grandparents when they married and built the house. A long, shady driveway to the house and 3 wide granite steps to the door. Gemma got out of the car, opened the trunk to get her laptop, and walked to the door. She knocked and waited. The door opened and Jake's grandfather appeared on the doorstep. Yes, young lady? Good afternoon, Mr. Van Dam. I'm Gemma Evans. Do you remember me? It's been a long time. Yes, I remember you. Wasn't your name mentioned in connection with that trouble about Jake's marriage? Yes, sir. I am here to tell you that Jake could not have had an affair with me. I can prove that I was in Edinburgh at the time. The old man looked at Gemma with piercing eyes, weighing her words. Gemma felt as if her soul was exposed under that gaze. Finally, he said, Call me Rufus. Senior. He said it with a twinkle in his eyes. Yes. It is very good and brave of you to come. My son and daughter-in-law are sure that Jake is the culprit. Am I? No. He's not capable of such a thing. May I ask why you want to prove his innocence? Gemma had a strong suspicion that this man would recognize any lie coming from anyone, and that lying to this man would humiliate him and herself in his eyes, so she answered honestly, Jake doesn't know it yet, but I'm going to be the next Mrs. Van Dam. But first I have to find him. Do you happen to know where he is, Mr. Van Dam? The old man's eyes gleamed mischievously as he replied, He's not in touch with his parents or his brother and sister, and I promised him not to tell anyone that he's at St. Christopher's Crossing now and is doing fine at the university there. But I can't be wrong when I say that you are a beautiful woman and not a man. Now that's our little secret. Don't spoil the fun? No, sir. I'll let you in on another secret. I was offered a job at the same university, and I accepted, so I'll be sure to run into him. From somewhere in the back of the house came a voice. Dad, who's there? Don't let them sell you what you heard. The old man grinned and turned to Gemma. Do you know where the kitchen is? Gemma nodded, but when she turned, she almost ran into Jake's mother. You have guts, she shouted. Ruin my son's marriage and then come into this house uninvited. Get out! Jake's grandfather immediately intervened and bellowed, Anna, she is my guest, and I will hear her out. She claims to have been abroad during this whole sordid affair. Anna Van Dam immediately deflated and looked at Gemma. What? I don't believe you. Gemma picked up her laptop, smiled at the old man, and said, I'll show you. An hour later, Gemma was looked at by a very upset mother and a very angry old man. What now? Whispered Anna. Gemma decided to tell the truth again. I don't know. I'll leave this pit tomorrow. Jake and I became fast friends and were on our way to becoming friends, if you can call it that. That was until Brooke came along. Gemma told her story of how she lost her friend and soulmate to Brooke. She didn't expand on her suspicions about the sudden pregnancy. It was up to Jake to do that if she could find him. Anna was appalled by the machinations of the mother of her grandchildren and decided that her husband, Jake Jr., should meet the woman too. She asked affectionately, Would you like to stay for dinner, my dear? Also, I would like you to tell this tale of woe to Randall, my husband. Gemma politely declined, saying she had to get ready to travel to her new job. At the same time, she would not tell Anna where her new job was located. As Gemma said goodbye, Anna looked away for a moment. Gemma, when or if you find Jake, let us know. It seems like we've been making bad decisions and mistreating him. I really want my youngest back. Gemma replied softly, If, or better yet, when I find him, I will pass on the message, but it is not in my authority to reveal his whereabouts. Jake disappeared for a reason, and it's obvious he doesn't want to be found. With those words, she walked to her car. Halfway there, she noticed a man approaching. Shit, Jake's brother! It flashed through her mind. She looked at the man. The man was well past his age and had gotten fat. He walked like a gorilla, and he looked like one. Rough cheeks, thick neck, broad shoulders, arms wide apart as if he could not put them parallel to his body as they should be, a prominent belly, small steps, two thick upper legs rubbing together, wheezing like an old steam engine. Rufus Van Dam looked closely at the slender, dark-haired woman. The woman seemed familiar to him, but he couldn't locate her. She needs bigger boobs. B-cups don't suit me, but what legs she has. I'd like to feel them wrapped around me. He walked into the house and met his grandfather. Do we have a guest here? I noticed that broad walking toward the gate. Rufus, seeing her keeping a blank expression on his face, replied, Yes, it was an old friend of Jake's who wanted to reconnect. But we don't know where he lives, do we? That worthless, cheating son of a bitch. Young Rufus said, thinking, Put that on thick. I still need him out of the way and as far away as possible in every way. He walked up the stairs and entered his apartment, specially created for him after his accident in the house. Brooke, meanwhile, was reflecting on her life. When the divorce took place, Jacob, better known as Jake, was 35 years old and she was 2 years older. Their children were 16 and 15 years old. They were born within a year of each other. They didn't meet right away. Brooke spotted the 18-year-old when she was finishing a 10-kilometer swim. She didn't dignify him with a glance at first, until that dark-haired girl came up to him and started helping him out of his wetsuit. That got her attention. Suddenly, he looked gorgeous. She watched the couple closely. The guy had reddish-brown cropped hair, green eyes, and an oval face with a well-defined nose over generous lips. Broad shoulders, long, strong arms with wide wrists and hands with long, thin fingers. Narrow hips and very muscular legs completed the picture. As the girl began to towel him dry and he raised his arms, she noticed how his muscles tensed. She later learned that Jake had the physique of a swimmer. Lots of strong muscles under a thin layer of fat, thick enough to hide how strong he really was. That's when she decided she wanted him and started planning how to make it happen. The fact that the girl was probably his girlfriend didn't deter her. It took Brooke 6 months to break through the shy man's barriers. As luck would have it, his girlfriend, who wasn't yet his girlfriend, was moving out of town, and it became much easier to manipulate the girl. Finally, Jake suggested that she meet his family for a monthly family barbecue. Brooke now knew that he was the youngest of 3 children and a late addition to the family. His brother was 6 years older and his sister was 4 years older. At the barbecue, she looked at the two brothers in amazement. They were the same height, hair color, and about the same face, but that was where the similarities ended and the differences became obvious. Rufus outweighed Jake by at least 60 pounds. Whereas Jake was elegantly built and didn't have too much noticeable muscle, his brother was built like a brick house with large, bulging muscles. Also, whereas Jake was a bit of a talker, taking his time to answer and speaking softly and measuredly, his brother was all hype, boom, and superficial communication. Rufus turned his attention to the pretty girl of his stupid younger brother. He despised the brat. He thought he was too smart to like him. He decided to give the young woman a little more attention, a little more love. It took Rufus 2 weeks, lots of gifts and attention, to get Brooke settled into a decent hotel. After a month, she realized she had missed her period. When she asked Rufus, he laughed in her face. "You should have taken the pill, you stupid bitch," he told her eventually. The only men Brooke had dated were her first boyfriend and Rufus, but after Rufus, she decided she could easily handle Jake. 3 months later, Jake and Brooke were married in a small ceremony, and Brooke had been happy as a clam in her shell ever since. She had a caring husband and a bad boy as her lover. Jake was wonderful in bed and a good provider, and she had a lover on the side. Just for quick and dirty sessions of casual fornication. Rufus was so small, his secretions were so insignificant, and it was over so quickly that even his scent didn't linger. The fact that she didn't always come didn't bother her in the least. She enjoyed getting away with it. 13 years later, his lifestyle caught up with him, and trouble befell Rufus. The long and heavy use of muscle-enhancing substances had finally presented its bill, and the bill was steep. His heart. He had just collapsed at the gym, and was lucky enough to have a nurse working out next to him. That one immediately started resuscitating him. He continued to do so until the ambulances arrived, and an automated ventilator was placed over Rufus. When doctors arrived at the hospital, after a few quick tests, they concluded that he had a ruptured myocardium caused by prolonged and excessive use of anabolic steroids. He was immediately sent for surgery. Rufus was discharged from the hospital as a man in a different body. The pronounced musculature was gone. He was flabby and in very poor condition. He soon realized that he would need constant and long-term care. Over the course of several months, he began to groom Brooke. He belittled Jake, telling Brooke that she should not have to put up with financial constraints and demand that Jake increase his income, that she deserved better, and he, playing the victim, was exaggerating his suffering. Gradually, his campaign had an effect. Brooke began to change her behavior toward Jake, and not for the better. She began to pick on him. At first, minor domestic irritants were enough to set Brooke off. A little later, she wanted her own car because the old junk wasn't something she wanted to be seen in. Brooke didn't notice what she was doing to Jake. Then again, she'd never pushed him this hard or this far. She faltered when Jake just walked away in the middle of a prolonged tirade. The kids had already run out of the room, wondering aloud when their father would stop taking hits. "Come back," she shouted. "I'm not done with you yet. Come back, you hear me?" Jake simply walked into his small office, closed the door, and turned on his laptop. A few minutes later, Brooke walked into the office. Jake looked up and growled, "Get out of here!" At that moment, Brooke realized that Jake had reached his limit, and if she kept pushing, he would retaliate. She, after being married to Jake for almost 15 years, never realized that he was one of those men who kept taking the hits in stride. It was only when his fingers were on the edge of the ravine that he would step back and react. When that happened to these men, they would start fighting back and explode without any warning. Jake looked into the rift that Brooke had torn in his soul and realized it was too deep. He'd had enough. He needed to protect himself. Jake had always known that Rufus would inherit the family company. It was a successful company that supplied the aviation industry with specially designed parts when there was a need for an airplane to perform above a guaranteed safety level. Jake earned a doctorate in aeronautics and a master's degree in industrial design. His grandfather was preparing him for his role as a future CTO. That was until his father took over the company. He pushed Jake aside. Jake suspected his brother had a hand in it, but he didn't care. He already had more work than he could handle. When his father had fired him on a technicality, he'd tried to get Jake to sign a document to keep him from working for the competition. Jake laughed out loud in his face, walked out, kissed his father's secretary, and sang the lyrics to Tommy by The Who. "I'm free," I'm free. And freedom tastes like reality. As he left the house. When a major competitor found out about Jake's layoff, they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He grabbed it with both hands. He was now working 28 hours a week for the same paycheck as he had at his father's company working full-time. The benefits were much better, too. Jake realized that his father and brother would want him out of the way and had expected it years ago. On his grandfather's advice, he started his own company and based it in Luxembourg. All of his freelance work went through this company. Most of the revenue went into an offshore internet account in one of the other tax havens in Europe. The other, smaller portion went into his regular account. Brooke never asked where the extra money was coming from, just that Jake was moonlighting on the side to get the extra funds. Suddenly, this arrangement became very convenient. He changed his instructions so that all the money went into an offshore account. He had absolutely no intention of stopping his freelance work. It wasn't even legally possible. Contracts had to be reckoned with. In his office, he decided that he needed to spend more time with his children, and so stopped working those ungodly hours. The next morning, Jake was reading the paper on his tablet, washing it down with his customary cup of coffee, when Brooke walked into the kitchen. "Where have you been all night?" "I've been waiting for you." "Sure, for about 5 minutes, and then you fell asleep." Cynicism doesn't suit you. Tell me everything. But before you drift off, I need to say a few words to you. Brooke swallowed the venomous reply. Instead, she said wryly, "Really, the word is yours." Jake said, "You do realize that yesterday I worked about 30 days of 15-hour days without a single day off. I did it just to meet your demands, and you keep asking for more. In all that time, I haven't seen the kids for more than 4 hours, and now that's going to change. I've returned all my freelance assignments to my clients. I now work 30 hours a week. No more. If you want more, get a job and work." He was quiet for a few seconds, and when Brooke started, he raised his hand. "I'm not done," he said. "I think your behavior towards me is horrible, and if you keep this up, we're going to get a divorce. The ball is in your court. I'm leaving, and for a change, I'm going to have breakfast that I didn't make myself." Jake walked out of the kitchen before Brooke could utter a word. She just stared at the door, sitting there with her mouth open. She had never seen Jake act like this before. She pulled out her cell phone and called Rufus. "Rufus, Jake is getting stubborn. I don't know how to deal with him anymore." Rufus grinned. "That's what I expected. I have a plan B." Jake was sitting at his desk when his secretary called to say he had a visitor. Surprised, he asked if he had any appointments for that day that he didn't know about. "No, sir, but she said it was urgent," was the reply. The elderly woman entered his office and asked him to introduce himself. She then handed him 2 sealed envelopes with the words, "I regret to inform you that you have already been served." The woman walked out shaking her head and said to the clerk, "Please look after him. This is very bad news indeed." Jake looked at the envelopes. For some reason, he felt relieved. It was all over now. He had expected it, but it still hurt like hell. What he hadn't expected was a restraining order forbidding him from contacting his wife, children, and parents. What really shocked him was the notarized affidavit stating that he had a relationship with Gemma Evans. With great pain in his heart, he began the necessary processes. Of course, the bank accounts were blocked. He looked into his professional connections to see if there was a lawyer among them. There wasn't one, but one client had gone through the same ordeal as Jake and referred him to her attorney. Finally, he rented a small apartment, just enough for the immediate future. Back to the present. Brooke noticed Olivia and Brian discussing something. Their voices were quiet, but not so quiet that Brooke could hear what they were talking about. It sounded like her son had a problem and wanted to talk to his father about it. Brooke interjected, "Why, if you have a problem, don't you talk to your Uncle Rufus about it?" Olivia mockingly replied, "What could that sweaty fat pervert have to say that even remotely resembles a reasonable person?" Brooke was stunned and insulted by proxy. She bit her tongue to keep from telling them who the real father was. "What, he's your uncle, mind you." "Yeah, not a bad uncle. Offered me money for showing my tits and said he'd reward me generously if I helped him ease his urges." "And that's not what he asked for," her daughter replied with disgust. Brooke thought, "That's his own daughter for crying out loud, and he knows it. If it's true what she's telling me, God help me." Many bodies were pulled out of the closet that night. Brooke had no choice but to conclude that Rufus was a pervert and a danger to her and her own children. The fact that nothing had happened was due to the fact that Jake had instilled self-esteem in the children. Now the serious problem was the fact that she would soon be dependent on Rufus for income and lifestyle. Jake was paying a huge amount of money for child support. Because of this, she had a relatively good situation and never failed to make payments, but it didn't last long. She found herself in a tight spot and was now starting to regret some of her decisions. Leonard Daltrey, it's finally a pleasure to meet you. Gemma Evans, and the feeling is mutual. I've heard a lot about you and all have been positive. I look forward to working with you. Professor Daltrey told Gemma about the ups and downs of the university and his role within it. He also informed her that he is a widower and lives with his girlfriend. The affable interview ended with Professor Daltrey saying, I have arranged temporary housing with my good friend Nathaniel Thompson. He lives on the St. Christopher Trail and has a guest house. Maybe you want something more comfortable? I suggest you check out the homes in St. Christopher's Woods. There are a few houses around the lake there and a few parcels of land with building permits for university employees, although I can tell you that the best lot is already occupied by our part-time amanuensis. The professor looked at him wistfully and continued, Perhaps I'll hire you. This man does an excellent job with children who aren't very gifted or have behavioral or learning problems. We recently got a special learning center. He helped design it so these kids can reach their full potential. I would love to have him as one of the teachers there. However, he is a very private person. Contact with him is not welcome, and so far he has declined my offers. Gemma has been exploring around St. Christopher's Wood. After 2 months of acclimatization, she decided that this was the place she wanted to stay for the long term and began looking for the right house. Nadia Thompson accompanied her. Suddenly, they came to a sign. It read, Land for sale. Below it in smaller letters. The building permit had already been obtained. Gemma exclaimed, What a beautiful place. I could live here. But who would design a house that would fit in with this surroundings, let alone build it? Nadia grinned. I know a man. He's becoming a good friend of ours. He's an aeronautical engineer and designer. You should see the house he designed for himself and is building himself. He's a bit of a recluse, but when he thaws out, he turns out to be very good company. I'm having him over for dinner on Friday. You'll be able to meet him if you want to, of course. I'd love to, replied Gemma cheerfully. Meanwhile at the Van Dam house. Grandpa? Brooke asked in a thin voice. Rufus Van Dam. Senior scrutinized the face of the woman sitting at his desk. The mother of his great-grandchildren, only born to the wrong man. He was a keen observer of human emotion and noticed she was very upset. Yes, dear. What's the matter? Do you happen to know where Jake is? Asked Brooke uncertainly. Honey, I'm not going to answer that question either affirmatively or negatively. Why are you asking? Trouble in paradise? The question caught Brooke off guard, and she almost whispered, yes, but swallowed her tongue in time. This reaction did not go unnoticed by the old man. Time to chop the axe for this lady. In a steely voice, he continued, Rufus has some very nasty character traits, don't you think? And his addiction to those steroids doesn't help at all. Brooke stammered, I don't know what you mean, honestly. Rufus Sr. grinned. Don't play games with me, young lady. I may be old, but I am far from decrepit as my son and eldest grandson like to think. I know those two adorable children of yours don't have Jake's genes. What? How dare you? Exclaimed Brooke. Don't mess with me, young lady. I'm willing to put my entire fortune on the line. What color are your eyes? Blue. And Jake's? Green. And both your children? Brown. There you go. It's almost genetically impossible. They look like they belong to Jake, because Rufus and Jake looked like each other once too. But Rufus has brown eyes and you spent a lot of time in his bed. Brooke felt the world crumble beneath her. She gripped the backs of the chairs until her fingers turned white. She tried to say something, but her tongue refused to obey. Grandpa was relentless. You're on your own. You put yourself completely at the mercy of the wrong man. You let him manipulate you and your children. And now that the outcome was not what you expected, you want Jake back in the saddle? Whether or not I know where Jake is, I'm not going to help you. Now get out. When Brooke left, Rufus Sr. stood in front of the window for a long time thinking, maybe it's time for me to write that long letter. The two women had become friends since Gemma had been boarding with the Thompson couple, but she had never been invited into their home until now. Waiting for an answer to her knock on the door, she looked around. She was a little nervous. The door opened. Oh, hi. You must be Gemma. I'm Nathaniel, but everyone calls me Nathan. Only Nadia, when she gets mad at me, calls me Nathaniel. Come on in. Nadia's in the kitchen. Gemma was a little shocked when she saw the scar running down the handsome face. As he turned to walk her into the kitchen, she noticed that he was very trim, but walked with a slight limp. What had happened to him? A warm welcome awaited her in the kitchen. Gemma introduced herself to Jacob, their young son, and then turned to Nadia. This house and its surroundings are stunning. How did you find such a gem? For a brief moment, Nadia's face lowered, and their whole story flashed through her mind as she contemplated what to answer. It is a long and sad story, but you might say with a happy ending. I'll tell it to you sometime, but since it's Nathan's story, I need his blessing to tell it. It is not common knowledge, only a few people know about it. All I can say for now is that Nathan wrested it from the hands of the local tyrants and destroyed them in the process. And Jacob is not mine. He belongs to Nathan and his first wife. He's divorced? Before he met you? No, he's a widower. But I am very happy to tell you that in 6 months, Jacob will no longer be an only child in this house. Gemma hugged Nadia, exclaiming, That's wonderful news. She wanted to ask when the baby would be born, but Nathan interrupted her. Gemma, let me introduce you to... Jake, Gemma exclaimed. Without thinking, she ran up to him and hugged him. Jake didn't react in any way, only said, Gemma, long time no see. Embarrassed, Gemma let him go. Nadia and Nathan looked at each other, and Nathan asked, Do you two know each other? Before Gemma could say anything, Jake answered, We used to be friends. Gemma's happiness collapsed, and tears welled up in the corners of her eyes. This was not the happy reunion she had envisioned. She cried, Jake, why are you acting so cold? Aren't you happy to see me? I missed you so much. Jake was surprised and even more confused. He looked at his hosts. Nathan only nodded and said, We'd better get out of your way right away. You can use the study over there. Sitting in the study, Jake looked at his former and now very upset friend. Gemma, he said, you told Brooke that you had sex with me while I was married to her. You even signed the affidavit. That was the end of my marriage. Why should I be happy to see you? Those lies hurt me deeply. It suddenly dawned on Gemma how deep the deception had gone. She resented the fact that Brooke had manipulated her in such a way to ruin Jake and Jake's image in the community where he lived. She sat up straight and said to Jake with firm determination in her voice, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Before coming here, I lived in Europe for 3 years. I would never have told her that. I heard Brooke bragging about it in the pub, and I told her off publicly right then and there. After that, I went to your parents to tell them where I'd been for the last 3 years. I talked to your grandfather, too. We had a good long talk. He was the one who told me that you were doing well and that it was likely that I would meet you here. I didn't realize it would happen so soon, and I had already decided to go and look for you. I've missed you a lot, to be honest. Jake blushed. But the affidavit? It's forged. And if you still have the original, someone's going to be in big trouble. Jake, I loved you, I still do, but I would never have gotten into bed with you when you were still a married man. I would never have done that to you. All this time I've been thinking about you betraying me and wondering what I did to you to deserve it. So you believe me then? Of course. You've provided me with at least one verifiable fact with just a phone call to my grandfather. I think you can prove the others just as easily. Most importantly, you've never lied to me in the past. So yes, I believe you. Gemma felt relieved. That hurdle had been overcome. The next was how to communicate her feelings to him. And would he reciprocate those feelings? She swallowed and, gathering all her courage, asked, Can we kiss and make up? At that, she pushed back her chair. Jake did the same, walked over to her and hugged her, asking, Can you forgive me? For what? Asked Gemma indignantly. You've been manipulated in the most horrible way. There is nothing to forgive. Jake wanted to kiss Gemma on the cheek, but Gemma quickly turned her head and her lips met his. Putting her hand behind his head, she pulled him against her and quickly ran her tongue over his lips. She broke the kiss afterwards, smiling broadly. Jake felt stunned. "Did you just kiss me? Did that really happen? Did you just kiss me?" he asked her. "Yes. I've wanted to ever since I found out you were no longer married to that harlot. I've already told Brooke that I have a claim on you. Just tell me when I'm in too much of a hurry. But slow or fast, I'm coming for you." Jake pondered this, enjoying the way Gemma's supple body pressed against his. "You know I'm damaged goods, don't you? There's a reason I'm building my home in such a remote location. I can only do things slowly. I needed to heal first, and I never dared to face my demons. It's just too painful. Let me in, I'll be there for you. Always. I know you married that harlot because she was pregnant. Otherwise, you'd be married to me. And worse, I've done a little math and wonder if it's your son. There's something very strange about that. Now it's time to join our hosts. One last piece of advice, if you'd like to take it. Accept a job offer from Professor Daltrey. It will do you a lot of good." When they returned, Gemma said simply, "Problem solved. He's mine now, although he's not entirely sure of that yet." Nadia clapped her hands together happily. "Great. That was a quick job. What's next?" Gemma snuggled up to Jake and pulled him to her. She smiled and replied with deep happiness in her voice. "I have plans. One has to do with retribution. One has to do with never letting that guy out of my sight again. And finally, who do I contact to get that piece of land we saw this afternoon?" The dinner was a great success and fun. Gemma told anecdotes from the days when they were friends. After dinner, things got more serious, and Gemma finally asked the hard question. "Jake, did that harlot explain how she gave birth to a fully developed son after a pregnancy of 6.5 months?" "No. You forget that I was there and was so enthralled that I never realized it. In retrospect, I can say that was very foolish of me. But what are you implying?" Nathan, knowing from his own experience how overwhelming it can be to witness the birth of a child, replied softly that it may not be yours and that you've been set up. "But they look like me and they look like a brother and sister. There's no doubt about that." "Both." Jake cut the phrase short, afraid to voice his thoughts. Immediately, 2 women crashed into him, hugging him and whispering quiet words in his ear. Jake pulled himself together and asked, "What now?" "I need to know for sure." Nadia took his hand and asked, "Can you think of a man who looks like you? Maybe a cousin?" Gemma exclaimed, "Rufus! It has to be him." Jake said, "No, they don't even like each other." Nadia didn't argue. "Or that was said so you wouldn't suspect them. I think there's only one way to find out, and that's an official paternity test. That means you need a great lawyer, and I know just the kind. Donna Marshall, she's not one of the best, but the best of the best. Nathan, can you give her a call?" Brooke had fallen on hard times. 2 weeks after Jake's grandfather had explicitly told her that he wasn't going to help her find Jake, she still couldn't find a way out of the situation. She didn't want her children to never see Rufus again, but she still needed him, if only for the money he brought in. She was making dinner while the kids were doing their schoolwork when there was a knock on the door. She looked through the small window and saw a man and a woman standing on the other side of the door. She opened it and asked, "Can I help you?" The woman asked, "Are you Mrs. Puckett? Mrs. Brooke Puckett, ex-wife of Mr. Jacob Randall Van Dam?" "Yes." "What's the matter?" The man now answered. "I have a warrant. We need to take DNA samples of your children. Failure to comply with this warrant will result in arrest." "What? Who? Why do you need DNA samples from my children?" "For a paternity test," the woman said simply, and in doing so knocked the ground out from under Brooke's feet. Brooke had always had a vague hope that children might be the only reason Jake would come back to her. The other, very important reason was that Jake was paying a huge amount of child support. If he found out that the children were not his, the payments would immediately stop and she would lose her comfortable lifestyle. Meanwhile, at the Van Dam house, another pair of paramedics, accompanied by a police officer, knocked on the door of Rufus Van Dam's apartment. Rufus Sr. watched the whole thing, thinking. It looked like Gemma had found Jake, and Jake had figured it all out. Now he was going to have hell to pay. Rufus Jr. had refused to cooperate and attacked a police officer. The obese man couldn't stand up to the young tough guy, and soon Rufus Sr. witnessed his grandson walk with a short and humiliating gait toward the police car. 2 weeks later, Jake? "The results are in!" shouted Gemma, walking through Jake's apartment. Gemma was dreading the results. It was going to be very difficult for Jake either way, and Gemma would have to work hard to support him. Jake and Gemma sat on the couch, and Jake read the document and the attached test results. When he finished, Gemma saw that he had turned white and was suddenly very worried. "Jake," she asked, "what's wrong?" "You look like you're having a heart attack." "I'm not having a heart attack, but I'm going to have one." Both kids belong to Rufus, and both he and that cheating bitch ex-wife are going to pay me back for everything they've done to me and more. Gemma pressed herself against Jake, trying to comfort him. He felt great around her, and she hoped it would be the same the other way around. Jake still didn't respond to her advances. They hugged, sometimes chastely pecking each other on the cheek, but nothing more. Gemma could already feel her need beating against the back of her teeth. She looked at his face, and suddenly Jake was looking at her again, with a vulnerable and shy expression in his eyes. "Gemma, please don't misunderstand me. I love you with all my heart, and I've been berating myself for letting Brooke drag me away when you weren't home. I know you need and want more than I can give at this moment. Please believe me when I say that these feelings are mutual. But before I give myself completely, I need to resolve this situation, and I promise I will resolve it. I will resolve it the hard way, and I don't want you in the thick of it. Also, if we start now, I feel like you'll become a rebound, and that wouldn't be fair to you and your feelings for me. I can totally understand if you don't have the patience for all of this and want to be free. Just tell me and we'll part without any hard feelings on my part." Relief came over Gemma like a cool shower after a hot and tiring day. She knew from the past how difficult it had been for this shy man to express his deepest emotions, and she acutely felt the deep love supporting those words. She gave herself a few seconds to savor these feelings. Releasing her hand from behind Jake's back, Gemma drew his head down and kissed him like she'd never kissed a man before. Softly, with a light touch of her tongue on his lips, and with all the love she had to give to this gentle and beautiful man. Jake felt as if a 9-volt battery had been applied to his lips. He was shocked for several reasons at once. The first was the obvious, and the second was that Gemma didn't want to take the way out he'd offered. She said softly, almost touching his lips, "Nonsense, Jake. No more excuses. You won't get rid of me that easily now that you've professed your love for me. You'll find me in the thick of things every second because I'll be there to support you and help you." Jake put his arms around Gemma, kissed the top of her head, thinking, "God, she smells so good," and whispered shyly, "Why don't you put off building the house until this mess is resolved one way or another? You probably won't need it by then. I might as well modernize and expand my house to suit your wishes." Gemma was stunned. Had he really just offered to let me move in with him? She decided to ask. "Does that sound like an invitation to move in with you?" "It does. You've just committed yourself to me, and I want you to know that I'm just as committed to you. If you want a ring and the appropriate ceremony that goes with it, I'll agree. But to me, marriage is an empty phrase. If we tell each other we're a faithful couple for life and jump the broom, it's just as valid to me. Yes, I want the ring. I want a ring as the symbol he's always personified in all its simplicity. So I want a small, simple, plain, ordinary, unadorned gold wedding ring, and I want you to have exactly the same. I'll bring the broom as soon as you pay your fee." That same week, Jake and Gemma sat in Donna Marshall's office while Jake explained that he wanted payback by napalm. Donna patiently explained that she was in no position to help. Jake needs a shark, or rather a bull shark. One capable of navigating the murky waters and attacking unexpectedly and effectively. However, Donna knew someone, a coworker of hers, who had been in a similar situation as him and despised those vermin who did it to others. Her promoter introduced him to her, and they have been referring clients to each other or working together on some cases ever since. Sometime later, Brooke was doing household chores and thinking about the fact that there was no response after the DNA tests. Cautiously, she began to hope that it would all go away. She had found a way to shield her children from Rufus's direct influence, and their grandfather had been very helpful after she had taken Rufus Sr. into her confidence. Rufus Jr. seemed to be afraid of Rufus Sr. ever since he was taken from the apartment by the police. Suddenly, her peace of mind was shattered by a heavy knock on the front door. She went and opened the door, and there stood Rufus. His face was purple, and his thick figure was shaking and trembling. He shouted at her, "What is this?" waving a stack of crumpled documents in his hand. Brooke took a few steps back. "I don't know. You tell me." Rufus shouted, "That asshole brother is demanding a huge sum of money from me for raising my children, and to enforce those demands, he has confiscated all of my property." Brooke staggered into the house and sank into a chair. Good God. Jake is awake and prowling. Now that he knows the kids aren't his, he's in for one hell of a payback. If he goes after me too, I'm finished. Edmond Dantes would be a teddy bear compared to Jake. She became very scared as her luxurious lifestyle came to an end. Rufus Jr. was still ranting when there was another knock on the door. Brooke tried to ignore it, but the knocking grew more insistent. She took a deep breath, got up from her chair, and walked to the door. When she opened it, she saw a small man with a hat, round glasses, and a mustache, something reminiscent of Professor Calculus from the Adventures of Tintin. Behind him stood a woman with a video camera whose flashing red light showed it was active. "Are you Mrs. Brooke Puckett?" he asked. When she answered in the affirmative, he handed her an envelope and said, "You have been served. Have a good day," and walked back to his waiting car. With terror in her heart, Brooke watched them go until the car disappeared around the corner. Only then did she step back, close the door, turn around, and walk to her chair. The terror turned into a black seething swirl. She opened the envelope, and her fear grew even worse as she looked at the documents. There were DNA tests proving that Jake wasn't the father of any of the children, but his brother was. The next documents were demands for reimbursement of the money she had received in child support, including interest, and other demands because she had made him think the children were his, and lured him into marriage with false accusations. The total amount of claims was staggering. There was another from Gemma Evans for falsifying an affidavit and one for defamation. Brooke had been in a panic until Rufus told her that the company would cover all the costs since the cat was out of the bag. After all, she was the mother of his children, wasn't she? Later that night, Brooke attended a family dinner. Rufus Jr. began to explain that they had developed feelings for each other, and Brooke was now his girlfriend. He would take care of the kids after their lawyers beat back the ridiculous demands of his idiot brother and his whore. His grandfather intervened gently. "You need to get yourself a lawyer. The company isn't going to pay for your deception and your girlfriend's deception. Jake has already suffered enough at your hands." There was silence at the table. Jake's father exclaimed, "Why not? He has a right to defend himself against these ridiculous accusations, doesn't he? The company has very skillful lawyers to counter this slander." Rufus Sr. replied, "First of all, the accusations are not ridiculous. They are completely true. The children are from Rufus and Brooke. They have been cheating on Jake from the beginning, and it appears that Jake has DNA evidence that the children are not his, but Rufus's. If that's the case, then Jake is right. Besides, the company has strict rules about fraternization, and you broke them all. So if the lawyers take the job, it won't be to fight Jake, but to enforce the company rules that Rufus has been breaking for about as long as Jake has been married to Brooke." Rufus's father exploded, "You can't do that! I'm the CEO, not you." Rufus Sr. laughed softly and replied, "But I own 70% of this company. I am the chairman of the board of directors. The board of directors can override any decision the CEO makes. Therefore, our legal team will not be used for a lost battle with a lawsuit just to satisfy your ego." Rufus Jr. exploded with rage. He kicked his chair and left the room. Once in the hallway, he froze, trying to catch his breath. Rufus Sr. dropped his napkin, apologized, and followed his youngest out of the dining room. In the hallway, he almost pitied the wreckage of what had once been a man, until he remembered what he had done to his brother. He walked past and said in a soft but unmistakable voice of venomous steel, "If I find out, I'll bury you so deep even the devil can't find you. Do you understand?" Rufus Jr. was soon stunned by the attack. His ego and arrogance soon asserted itself, and he growled back, "And how do you think you're going to accomplish that, old man? I have powerful friends too, you know. Just try it, and you'll realize that this old dog can still bite." With those words, Jake's grandfather walked over and patted the still breathing heavily on the man's back lightly, Tisk, tisk. You've got to do something about this condition of yours or you'll never grow old. In his apartment, he sat down at his desk, picked up his old and trusty Rolodex, and looked up the phone number for the University of St. Christopher's Crossing. The next morning, at breakfast, Rufus Sr. was besieged by his son Randall and Rufus Jr. to get him to let them use the company's legal advisors. After a long study of the documents, they realized that this legal battle was going to be expensive, and the only way to win was to fight as long as possible in hopes that Jake would run out of money. Alas, the old man stuck to his opinion and even backed it up by saying, "If I get even a hint that you sought the advice of a lawyer working for the company, you'll be fired and out on the street before you realize what happened. This is a misuse of company assets. Understand?" He bit both men on his way out of the dining room. At his desk, he called the university. "Good morning. This is Professor Van Dam. I'd like to speak with Professor Daltrey. If he can spare me some time, I would be very grateful." A few minutes later, he heard a familiar voice. "Rufus, old friend. I haven't heard your voice in a long time. How are you?" Rufus Sr. smiled but replied seriously, "Mentally, I'm fine. Physically, not so much. But more on that later. I need one favor that involves two people." "Always, my friend." "You supported me in that disreputable affair with that shorty, blackmailing university students into turning in work to his bed. You always had my back. Now I can repay you in kind." "I don't think you'll like that, Leon. I'm going to come to your house and try to steal 2 of your employees for my company. I don't have any other choice." "Which 2? "Jake Van Dam and Gemma Evans." "Oh," said Leon. "I understand your grandson, but Miss Evans?" "I had a chat with Miss Evans, and she told me that rumors had reached her about Jake's marriage and some foul play. She came to the house to rectify the situation and said she wanted to track down Jake since he was divorced. Judging by the commotion in my family, she found him, and I seriously believe they've already connected." "You wouldn't be wrong. When are we going to see each other?" "I'm asking to make them available when you want to talk to them." "Is it a 2-hour drive?" "I can be on my way within half an hour. I would like you to be present as well. Is that possible?" "I'll make it possible." "You seem to be in a hurry." "Yes," Rufus Sr. replied simply. "I'll see you in a few hours." Later that day, Leon was shocked by the appearance of his old friend. He looked frail and tired, but his voice was strong and his eyes still sparkled. Before Leon invited Jake and Gemma into his office, the older men had a tense conversation. Jake, Gemma, Leon, and Rufus Sr. sat in Leon's office. The reunion between Jake and his grandfather was bittersweet. Regret that the reunion had taken so long and happiness that they could hug each other again. There was no need for introductions. Rufus Sr. began at once. "Jake, would you like to come to my place and take over the company?" A stunned Jake asked, "But Grandpa, why, what about Dad and Rufus?" Rufus smiled sadly and replied, "I am sick, and that sickness is progressing. I am now at the stage where I may not be able to stand up to this horrible couple who are now running and destroying my company. I know firsthand that you can lead a company. I've seen you in action." Jake looked shocked and grabbed Gemma's hand. "I don't know what to say. Why didn't you tell me?" "I have my reasons, Jake." "But can you answer my question? Surely your girlfriend must be agreeable too." "But I'm building a house here, a family home for both of us, Grandpa." Gemma raised her head and looked at Jake. "A family home? Who's talking about taking it slow now?" Jokingly, she interrupted him. "Do you want me to stop taking the pills?" Jake replied, "As soon as possible. I'd like to have a few kids of my own if you're willing to help me with that." Gemma jumped up from her chair and kissed Jake hard in front of the other 2 men. "I took my last pill last night." "Is that answer enough for you?" Rufus's voice broke through the happy intermezzo. "Jake and Gemma, may I remind you that you are still in the company? Also, Jake, the company office is less than an hour away from here." Jake looked Gemma in the eye. Gemma nodded subtly to Jake's acceptance of Rufus's offer to run the company. Jake turned to his grandfather. "The question remains, what to do about my father and brother? Leave that to me. When you take over, they won't be able to give you any more trouble. You are not the only one who holds a grudge against them. When do you want me to take over?" So you're going to do that? Run the company? That makes me so happy. Yes, Grandpa, we'll do it. But when? I am at the end of my life. Soon the symptoms will make themselves known, and the pain will become unmanageable. Because Leon witnessed his wife's horrible death, he and others have set up a small private clinic where end-of-life care will be facilitated. I plan to go there in about 10 days. I think shortly after that. Jake was silently pondering when Gemma asked, "But what's the whole cloak and dagger thing about?" I suspect Randall and Rufus will go to any lengths to preserve their way of life. Jake has already become a pain in Rufus's ass, and I've already had to threaten him because he wanted to use the company's law office to fight the lawsuits Jake initiated. Leon interjected, "We've developed a fight plan to protect you two from Randall and Rufus." He looked at his old friend and asked, "Shall I do the honors, or do you want to do it yourself?" Rufus Sr. replied, "You do it, I'm getting tired." Leon continued, "Once Rufus passes away, a message will be sent to some trusted managers in the company's office, workshop, and factory. They will put the entire company on lockdown. I will write a little software similar to the infamous ransomware that will allow this to happen. The employees will be sent home for the entire time with full pay, of course. We've made provision for that." Jake and Gemma were stunned at the scale of it all. Jake asked, "What about us? What is our role in this?" "Of course you will be informed too, but you must do nothing until the will is announced. That's when everything will be known and you can take over the company. By then, Randall and Rufus will be the least of your worries." Jake's grandfather sighed tiredly. "We've already taken care of that." He raised his eyes to Jake and said, "I'll write you a letter explaining everything. In the meantime, it's best that you remain in the dark about everything that's going on." "Grandpa, will you let me visit you at the clinic?" asked Jake with a tremor in his voice. "No, son, you'd better leave me alone. It won't be a pretty sight, and I want to be alone when I meet my maker. This is a farewell for us. One last question. Please take care of your mother. She, like you, is an innocent bystander." "I promise, Grandfather. We will take care of Mom." With that, they said goodbye, and a very emotional Jake headed home with Gemma in his arms. It took some time at Jake's apartment before Jake and Gemma were able to digest this sad news. After a while, Jake said with a deep sigh, "I'm going to miss the old man. He was like a father to me, much more than my father. He only had eyes for Rufus." The only response Gemma could give was to hug and kiss Jake, saying, "I know." 2 weeks later, Jake had just finished negotiating with a contractor to finish his, now their home in the woods, when the sad news came. Jake wanted to finish the house as soon as possible, and Nathan had recommended this contractor to him as fast, quality, and reliable. After deciding to stay together, Jake remodeled the house and expanded it significantly. It will now be a 5-bedroom home with 2 living rooms and everything that goes with it. The house would be heated by a deep geothermal system, and the power would come from solar panels and 2 wind turbines. Jake was sitting in front of the house with the sad news in his hands when Gemma arrived. She tried to comfort him, but she only partially succeeded. Jake said he felt like something had been cut off of him. The next day, the probate lawyer called him to the reading of the will. Jake drove with Gemma and was getting ready for what was in store for him when he noticed a black sedan following him. He quickly steered the car into the parking lot next to the mall and was about to get out when a black car pulled up next to them. A woman got out of the car and gestured for him to roll down the window. Jake did so without turning off the engine or pressing the gas pedal until the woman showed her ID. "Sir, we're with the FBI, and we want to protect you until this case is over. When you come to the reading, please act like you don't know we're here. Everything will be revealed during the reading according to Mr. Van Dam's wishes." Jake entered the conference room, leaving Gemma in the waiting room, and found his father, mother, and Rufus Jr. already seated. Rufus Jr. grinned. "Look, the prodigal son has come to see if there is anything here for him. Now I'll make sure you don't get anything, you little rat." The lawyer interrupted him. "Sir, behave yourself or I'll have you thrown out." "Understood." Rufus wanted to say something else, but the lawyer, this time very forcefully, said again, "Sir, behave yourself. Next time you can sit outside the building and wait for your family. Now you understand, and I demand an answer as to what you understand." Rufus muttered something, and the lawyer staggered forward again. I can't hear a word you're saying. You do or do not understand that the next time you violate house ethics, you will be removed from the premises. Randall backed away to interrupt him, but a raised hand stopped him. He recognized a man who was not to be trifled with. Good. Now that the shenanigans are over with, we can get down to the official part. An image suddenly came over Jake. It was Gandalf, the wizard from Lord of the Rings. The lawyer was exactly that kind of man. Friendly and gentle, but testy towards people who tried to provoke him. Suddenly, he would become tough, relentless, and eager to retaliate. He was brought back to reality when he heard his name called, just in time to hear what was read aloud. All of my property in this office is reserved for my only son, to Jacob Randall Vandam, who will henceforth be my successor as chairman of the board of Vandam Aeronautical Industries. What? What did Grandpa mean by only son? It's Dad, isn't it? What's going on? Jake thought, puzzled. Jake's mother sat nonchalantly in her chair, her lips curving slightly in a smile, while Randall and Rufus exploded. I'm his son, and Rufus is my son. I'll tear you apart, you crook, roared Randall at the lawyer. The lawyer didn't even blink and press the button. A few seconds later, the door opened, and 4 men appeared. They looked like they could rip the arms off a gorilla without batting an eye, and took up position next to the enraged men. One of them growled to Randall, "You're not going to make me hurt you, are you, mister?" Randall immediately deflated, but Rufus, who was not noted for his restraint, tried to pounce on Jake, shouting, "I'll kill you, you bastard!" The next moment he was sitting up again. His face reflected agony, and he was rubbing his thumb and wrist. Now that calm had been restored, the lawyer continued. My dear friend Rufus predicted this little unpleasant scene. That is why I asked these gentlemen to be present to keep the peace. He looked at Randall and said, Mr. Vandam has genetic evidence that you are not his son. He divorced your mother for a reason. Therefore, Rufus Jr. is not his grandson. The lawyer waited a moment to let him know that the message had reached him, and then went on inexorably, still looking at Randall. When he learned how you were treating your wife, and that you were renting an apartment at the company's expense and having fun, again at the company's expense. With escort ladies, he proposed to your wife, and she gladly accepted. Your wife got pregnant by Jacob Randall Vandam. We have notarized affidavits and again genetic proof that the second son of Anna Vandam Hansen and Rufus Vandam is Jacob Randall Vandam. Randall looked like he was about to explode, and he did explode. He lashed out at his wife. You're a whore! You cheated on me. You're going to pay for this. I'll sell you to a Russian brothel, he shouted. The lawyer interrupted, gesturing for 2 men to immobilize Randall. At the same time, Rufus imitated a goldfish on land very well. The lawyer said to the men, Will you please admit this behavior and threats into evidence? And to Randall, you will do nothing of the sort. We have evidence of grand embezzlement committed by you and your son. You stole approximately $6 million from the company to support your dissolute lifestyle, not counting the money you both stashed away in the Cayman Islands. In addition, you sold security-sensitive technology to rogue states and competitors. So some of the government agencies charged with keeping this country safe, the IRS and the FBI, want to have an in-depth conversation with both of you about this. Whether you like it or not, you're both going to help them with their investigation. He looked at the 4 men holding Randall and Rufus in their seats and said, Would you be so kind as to escort these men to the exit and turn them over to the authorities? Brooke waited outside. She saw Jake walk in with this woman, Gemma. Gemma kept her word as she saw Jake give her a masterly hug. Half an hour later, her world came crashing down as she saw Rufus and his father being let out, read their driver's licenses, and taken away in separate cars. What happened here, Brooke thought. After a few seconds, panic overwhelmed her and she clutched at one of the men escorting the father and son and handed them over to the police. I can't tell you, ma'am. All I can tell you is that they are going to assist the authorities in their investigation, and it's going to take a long time, the man said. One of them explained, Looks like they're wanted for fraud, embezzlement, industrial espionage, and transferring classified technology to sanctioned countries. I guess we won't see them again in the next 20 years. Who will run Vandam's industries when they're gone? Asked Brooke, while the emptiness in her stomach grew deeper. The other person. The one who came in with that snitch in his arms. Suddenly, Brooke felt unreal. She didn't know what had happened in the office, but Jake had come out on top. The luxurious life and protection from Jake's lawsuit that Rufus had promised her had evaporated. Depressed, she walked to Rufus's car and found it unlocked and the key fob lying on the center console. Distraught, she drove home. 1 month later, Brooke was on a tear. Her meager income wasn't enough to support a household, let alone the luxuries she had grown accustomed to in her, as she called it, former life. Now she had to find a plan on how to increase her income or reduce her expenses. Of particular concern was the children's school fees. The only way out she saw was to try to get Jake to take care of the children, which meant she'd have to pry him out of that harlot's arms again. In her time with Rufus, she'd partied a lot, drank a lot. At Rufus's insistence, she'd had considerable plastic surgery to tighten the belly that had appeared after the birth of her 2 children, had her breasts lifted and enlarged, had a facelift, and had her lips tinted. As a result, she had lost her natural look, which was what had attracted Jake. Now she looked like singer Cher, but without the healthy glow. Brooke's skin was kind of loose and artificial. Brooke paid no attention to any of this and was sure she could replace that harlot Gemma without a problem. Early morning. Brooke was sitting in her car. She parked it so she could see who would be coming out of the house. If it was Jake, she would leave and come back another time. And if it was that harlot, she would wait a few minutes to make sure there was little chance of Gemma returning, and then go bang on the door and get her husband back. Suddenly, she saw a blue Nissan Rogue appear and disappear around the corner in a flash. She checked her makeup one more time, waited 5 minutes, got out of the car, and walked to the front door. Brooke had heard that Jake had designed and partially built the house himself. She forced herself to take a good look so she knew what to praise. She could always encourage him to remodel the house to his liking. The house seemed to grow out of the hill. It perched at the top and its facade faced north. The small front showed 2 large windows next to the door, covered by shutters. Brooke took a deep breath, pulled her shirt down a little to emphasize her cleavage, pulled the door knocker back and released it. The knock rumbled through the house and Brooke waited. And waited she did. Just as she was about to turn around, the door opened silently and Jake appeared. He looked her over, his face expressionless, but he said nothing, certainly not inviting her in. Finally, she said in a sultry voice, "Hi, Jake. You look good. Life is treating you well, I see." "Brooke, I've been waiting for you to call for some reason." "What do you want?" "I want us to talk." "Aren't you inviting me in?" Jake sighed. "Let's get this over with once and for all." He thought. "Then come in," he replied tiredly. He led her into his office. It was closest to the door, and he didn't want Brooke assessing the rest of the house. Jake guessed why she had come. Gesturing for her to sit down, he took the chair on the other side of the desk and said, "Okay, Brooke, talk. What do you want from me? Aren't you going to show me the rest of the house?" "No, why would I?" "Now tell me why you're here." "Jake, don't you realize we belong together? We have a history and 2 children together. Now I need you to come back to me." Jake looked at Brooke. A thought flashed through his mind. What's going on here? Is she going crazy? Out loud, he said, "We do have a history. But my recollection of that history is a hell of a lot different than yours. You must be out of your mind if you think you and I will ever get back together." Jake's answer didn't seem to bother Brooke in the least. "I admit I made a mistake, but there are still children to think about. I can't provide for them properly. They're not mine. I have conclusive evidence that they're from my half-brother. So why should I do this? You've raised them the longest and you've done a very good job of it. Rufus has never been able to take proper care of them." Jake sighed and replied, "Don't worry. I'll take care of them. Only because my mother, their grandmother, asked me to. She begged me to take care of them, and I took care of them so that you couldn't get your greedy hands on that money. I certainly don't want to improve your lifestyle." Brooke stammered. This was not at all how she had envisioned this conversation. Jake had always been amenable to her demands, and she had completely forgotten about what had happened before their divorce. Now she'd hit a wall. She wanted him to take care of her children and herself. She tried a different approach. "Jake," she purred, "I know I've hurt you, but it's all because of Rufus's influence. Now that he's out of the world, we can be very useful to each other. Think what I can do for you. I know tricks in bed that would blow your mind. Dump that frigid witch and come back to me. We could have a good life. The four of us, like a family should. Jake was silent for a few moments, and Brooke decided she had won the battle. It had the opposite effect on the man in front of her. You look and act like a prostitute. Our past makes me think I should avoid you at all times. I'm not going to touch you, even in a dangerous costume. As for your children, I've arranged housing in St. Christopher's Crossing, since Olivia will be attending college there. Brian will be living with his grandmother until he goes to college there as well. You will not be able to properly care for him and provide housing for him, so I have taken care of that. However, you will not get a dime from me. In fact, you have an outstanding debt to me. Jake was silent for a moment, and Brooke was completely stunned by his outburst. Then he continued. If you try to resist, I will file a fraud and extortion report, telling the authorities that the children are not mine and that you ripped me off during the divorce because of it. Now get out. I'm done. As Jake fell silent, they both heard the door open. Gemma peeked out from around the corner and Jake said, Come in, my visitor is about to leave. A radiant Gemma entered the room with a very noticeable potbelly. She walked almost impetuously over to Jake and kissed him on the cheek. She whispered quietly so Brooke wouldn't hear. My suspicions proved correct. There are two of them. When Jake's smile grew even wider, Brooke couldn't hold back any longer. You're pregnant. She cried out loudly when she saw that her and Jake's plans had gone awry. Gemma and Jake looked at each other, and Jake nodded almost imperceptibly. Gemma turned to Brooke and said, Yes, I'm pregnant. I'm going to give Jake his own children. The children he has deserved for so long. Now I hear you're leaving? We need to make plans, remodel the kids' room. Suddenly, a quarter fell on Brooke. The kids? You mean... Gemma's face lit up. Yes, I'm having twins. I'm 3 months pregnant. I got suspicious when my belly started bloating so early. The first echogram didn't show both fetuses because one was hiding behind the other. This echogram showed two in their gender. She kissed Jake hard on the lips and whispered, Boys. Brooke said, You can't do this to me. Abandon me to my fate. Take my children, your niece and nephew. Jake decided it was time to drop all pretense of politeness and replied in a tone that Brooke knew all too well, but Gemma had yet to experience. I don't know who Olivia and Brian are to me. You tell me that and keep in mind that Randall was not the biological son of Rufus Sr., and I am not Randall's biological son, but from Rufus Sr. We have the same mother, though. Since Randall and Rufus Jr. were arrested, Brooke has had no contact with them. Anna refused to get close and wanted nothing to do with her. It became clear to Brooke that she was truly isolated and on her own. She didn't have a decent job and lived in a rundown apartment, for which she had to sell her valuables one at a time. She lowered her head and almost didn't notice that Jake had spoken again. If it were up to me, you could rot in hell. But my mother and Gemma are convinced that if I do that, you'll be a quivering sick ruin of a human being. I'm okay with that, but they told me again that you're still the mother of your children, and they might feel obligated to take care of you, and that would come at a cost I don't want them to pay. So I found a job for you. Simple physical work. That will pay the rent and basic living expenses. Brooke had already applied for several jobs, but was rejected each time. She would have to look somewhere far away to find a job, and she wouldn't be able to see her children at all. Jake handed her a card with an address and phone number, and Gemma said, This is your only chance to keep in touch with the kids, because it's the only job for you after the lawsuits are heard by the judge. If you don't use it, we will take our hands off you. And we won't take your children. They've decided on their own that Olivia will live at St. Christopher's Crossing and Brian will live with Anna. They understand perfectly well what you've done to the man they thought was their father. Now Gemma gestured to Brooke that it was time to leave. In front of the door, she told Brooke, In the end, I won. I have Jake and I will have his children. Your selfishness ruined Jake. You bet on the wrong man for imaginary luxury. I have the best man and you have nothing. Gemma cast a hard look at Brooke and continued, I'm warning you. If you try anything with Jake, I will stand in your way. If you try to manipulate your children and try to turn them against him or hurt Jake in any way, I will come after you and I will not stop until you are completely destroyed. Do you understand? Brooke's mouth dropped open at the blatant threats and overt hostility that Gemma radiated. Answer me. Do you understand? You've hurt Jake enough, and it stops here and now. Do you understand what I'm saying? Brooke spoke very forcefully, almost shouting. Brooke replied softly, Yes, I understand. No direct contact with Jake, only through you. Yes. Now get out. Brooke, who a few hours ago had stood so confidently in front of the mirror, was no more. Her world had crumbled in the last 45 minutes. Brooke walked to her car. Inside, Gemma was nestled snugly in Jake's lap. She sighed, You're mine. It took me almost 20 years to get here, but we're together again. In spite of Brooke and thanks to her stupidity, after a moment she rose to her feet and pulled Jake with her. We need to practice. Practice? What for? Asked Jake. Number 3, of course. And giggling, she pulled him into the bedroom. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.